I want you to imagine a time, and really, I mean, it wasn't that long ago, when a single income from a manual labor job could literally buy a home.
Right. An entirely different economic universe.
Yeah, that one single paycheck could support a whole family. It guaranteed a solid pension for your old age. And, it even paid for an annual family vacation to a seaside town like Skegness or Blackpool.
And the crazy thing is that baseline level of security wasn't even considered a luxury. I mean, it was just the expected standard for the working class back in the post-war era.
Exactly. So hold that image in your mind and just contrast it with the reality we are seeing today.
It's bleak.
It really is. We're looking at dual-income households relying on food banks just to feed their kids. People are trapped in this highly precarious gig work where they don't even know, like, how many hours they'll be assigned next week.
Right, the zero-hour contracts.
Yeah. And we are seeing millions of people renting privately, handing over, 60% of their take-home pay just to keep a roof over their heads?
With zero prospect of ever owning a home.
Yeah. So the contrast is just staggering. How did we get from that level of security to this insane level of precarity?
Well, I'd say that is the defining sociological question of our time. And to answer it, we really have to look past the surface-level economic indicators and examine the structural foundations of society.
Which brings us to today's mission for this deep dive. We are unpacking a remarkably raw and frankly fascinating interview from the Peter McCormack Show.
Yeah, featuring sociologist Lisa McKenzie and historian Keith Gildart.
Right. And the thesis they present is highly provocative. They are arguing that the British working class didn't just slowly fade away due to, natural economic evolution.
No, not at all.
They argue it was systematically dismantled, culturally, economically, and politically over the last 40 years.
It's a really multifaceted dismantling. I mean, the source material forces us to look beyond just the closure of factories or coal mines. It pushes us to examine the erosion of an entire cultural identity.
The fracturing of social mobility, too.
Exactly, and the total realignment of the political landscape.
Now, before we really get into the weeds here, I do need to establish a very clear baseline.
Oh, definitely. This gets heavy.
It does. The material we are covering today touches on some highly charged political topics. The guests on this show offer some blistering critiques of both left-wing and right-wing governments.
Right.
They dive heavily into the economics of immigration, and they analyze polarizing political movements like the rise of Reform UK. So I want to assure you, as you listen, that we are entirely neutral guides here.
Completely impartial.
Yeah, we are not endorsing any political party, nor are we taking sides in these debates. Our sole purpose is just to map out the arguments exactly as they're presented in the source material. We just want to break down the underlying logic so you can fully understand these complex shifts.
Objectivity is crucial when unpacking material that is this dense. We have to look at the mechanics of these arguments without letting our own political priors cloud the analysis.
Right. We are just charting the territory so you can navigate it yourself.
So, to start mapping this out, we really have to define the subject. Like, what does it actually mean to be working class today?
Which used to be easy, right? If you go back to the 1970s, the definition felt fairly obvious. It was the coal miner, the steel worker, the factory machinist.
Yeah, it was highly occupational.
Exactly. But reading through McKenzie's analysis, it is super clear that relying solely on someone's bank account or their job title just doesn't work anymore.
No, the occupational definitions have completely fractured. I mean, the industrial landscape that defined the traditional working class has vanished, but the class system itself hasn't.
So how do we define it now?
Well, to explain this invisible architecture, Lisa McKenzie relies heavily on a framework developed by the really influential French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu.
Yeah, I was looking into Bourdieu's work to understand McKenzie's angle here. He argues that class isn't just about your paycheck. He breaks society down into a collection of resources, or what he calls capital.
Right, and he splits his capital into 4 distinct categories.
Okay, so the first one is straightforward, right? Economic capital.
Yes, economic capital is the most tangible metric. It is your income, your accumulated wealth, property, stocks, assets.
The literal money you can deploy to solve problems.
Exactly. Or to secure advantages. If your car breaks down and you have high economic capital, it's just a minor inconvenience.
Right, you just pay to fix it.
But if you have low economic capital, a broken transmission can trigger a cascading crisis that results in, losing your job and your home.
That makes total sense. But the source material stresses that if we only look at economic capital, we miss the hidden levers of power. Because the second type of capital is social capital. which is basically your network.
It's the people you know,
Yeah.
and more importantly, the people your parents know. Social capital is your Rolodex.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, if a young person is trying to get a foot in the door in a highly competitive industry like law or publishing, do their parents have a friend who can secure them a summer internship?
Right. Or if they run into legal trouble, do they know a barrister they can call for informal advice?
Exactly. Social capital acts as both a safety net to catch you when you fall and an escalator to accelerate your upward mobility.
Which feeds directly into the third category. And this is the one that I think is the most insidious because it is completely invisible. Cultural capital.
Oh, cultural capital is fascinating because it operates almost entirely on a subconscious level. It represents your connection to societal norms, elite education, and high culture.
It's the unwritten code of conduct in powerful spaces, right?
Yes, it's the vocabulary you use, the accent you have, the confidence you project.
It's whether you know which fork to use at a formal dinner or whether you feel a sense of like inherent belonging when you walk into a corporate boardroom or a contemporary art museum.
Right. Did you grow up in a house filled with books? Were you taken to the theater? Were you encouraged to debate politics at the dinner table?
All those little things add up.
They do. They forge a specific type of confidence. So when someone with high cultural capital walks into a job interview, the interviewer, who likely shares that same cultural capital, instinctively recognizes them as one of us.
Oh, wow. Yeah. They're deemed a good cultural fit.
Exactly, which is often just a polite euphemism for class alignment.
That is so true.
Mm.
And when you aggregate those three, economic, social, and cultural Bourdieu says you achieve the ultimate form, which is symbolic capital.
Symbolic capital is the final boss of this framework. It is the overarching status, prestige, and legitimacy that society grants you.
So if you possess the first three capitals in abundance, society just looks at you and naturally assumes you are competent and deserving of leadership.
Your authority is simply taken for granted. You get the benefit of the doubt in almost every scenario.
Okay, let's unpack this using an analogy, because I think this is so important to grasp. Think of life like an expansive open-world video game.
Okay, I'm with you.
Economic capital is your in-game currency.
Yeah.
It's your gold coins. You absolutely need it to buy gear and survive. But social and cultural capital, that's like starting the game with the entire map unlocked and a strategy guide in your inventory. You know exactly where the hidden traps are, you know the fastest shortcuts, and you have a guild of high-level players ready to help you bypass the most difficult boss fights.
That is a great visual.
So if you are working class, you're playing the exact same game, but with the fog of war turned on. You can only see 2 feet in front of your face, you don't know the rules of the terrain, and every single step into the unknown is a massive, potentially game-ending risk.
I like the fog of war concept, but honestly, Bourdieu would actually argue the working class isn't even allowed on the same server.
Wait, really?
Yeah, because your analogy implies that a working class person, if they just grind hard enough, can eventually uncover the whole map. But cultural capital is actively designed to be a walled garden.
Oh, I see.
The rules are intentionally complex and constantly shifting, specifically to keep out those who weren't born into it. It's not just about a lack of information, it's about an active mechanism of exclusion.
That makes the distinction much sharper. But let me push back on this framework a bit, because the real world is incredibly messy, and the source material grapples with this directly.
Sure.
Let's look at 2 hypothetical people. Person A is a highly skilled plumber who owns his own business. He's working class by origin, but he's pulling in a 6-figure salary.
Okay, so he's got plenty of in-game currency.
Exactly. Now, person B is a university graduate with a master's degree in art history. They work at a gallery making maybe £35,000 a year, but their parents are wealthy corporate executives. How on earth does this framework classify them? Who is the working class one?
This is exactly the tension that Lisa McKenzie explores in the interview. If we look at the university graduate first, their economic capital from their own labor is relatively low. I mean, 35 grand doesn't go far in a major city.
Right.
However, their social and cultural capital are off the charts. They have the accent, the network, the institutional knowledge, and most crucially, they possess what is essentially a hidden insurance policy.
The bank of mom and dad.
Exactly. If the gallery closes down, or they want to buy a house, or they just need to quit their job for their mental health, they are not going to end up in a homeless shelter. They will fall back on their family's aggregated capital.
So functionally, they are middle or upper middle class, regardless of their current paycheck.
Exactly. They are playing with a safety net. If they fall off the tightrope, they bounce back up.
Whereas if the plumber falls off, Like if he gets injured and can't work, he might have some savings, but he likely doesn't have the network to instantly pivot to a high-paying desk job.
Precisely. And to highlight how contested these definitions are, the interview brings up a fascinating quote from Mick Lynch, a very prominent trade union leader in the UK.
Oh, right. This part was wild.
Yeah, Lynch was asked to define the working class, and he used the example of someone earning a £100,000 salary with a £1 million mortgage.
£1 million mortgage.
I know. Lynch argued that because this person still relies on a wage to pay that massive mortgage, because they still have to sell their labor to survive, they are technically still part of the working class.
That implies a staggering amount of earning power, though.
It does. Lynch is applying a very rigid, orthodox Marxist framework there. In that classical view, there are only two real classes: those who own the means of production and those who must sell their time and labor to those owners.
So in Lynch's view, the corporate lawyer and the janitor are both selling their labor, so they are in the same broad class struggle.
Right. But Lisa McKenzie, the sociologist, fiercely rejects this characterization. I mean, she calls it utterly absurd.
And you can understand her anger when you look at the reality on the ground. If you broaden the definition of class so widely that a corporate executive pulling down $100K with a £1 million house is categorized alongside a single mother working 3 zero-hour contract jobs.
You completely erase the specific visceral suffering of poverty.
Exactly. You neutralize the term working class until it means absolutely nothing.
Mackenzie's argument is like lumping those two lived realities together completely ignores the mechanics of precarity. We are talking about communities where people are one missed paycheck away from total ruin. People who are utilizing food banks in record numbers.
Yeah.
To look a warehouse worker in the eye, someone handing over more than half their wages to a private landlord, and tell them they share the exact same socioeconomic struggle as a homeowner with a £1 million asset. She finds that intellectually dishonest and deeply insulting.
So as you're listening to this, take a moment to audit your own capitals. Which ones are driving your career? Did you secure your current position strictly through your raw economic output?
Or do a little bit of social capital, maybe a war introduction from a former colleague and alumni connection help unlock that door?
It's an invisible web, and every single one of us is suspended in it somewhere.
And understanding the architecture of that web is essential, because the core thesis of the source material is that over the last 40 years, the fundamental economic engine of the traditional working class was deliberately dismantled.
The foundation was ripped out.
Yes, leaving millions of people with completely depleted capital across all four of Bourdieu's categories.
So if that web of capital is what keeps you afloat, what happens when the primary engine generating your economic capital is demolished overnight?
It's catastrophic.
Which brings us to the profound devastation of deindustrialization. We are moving from the era of the coal mine to the era of the automated warehouse.
Right. And to understand the scale of this loss, Keith Gildart, the historian, maps out the timeline. After the Second World War, Britain entered a long, sustained economic boom that stretched from the 1950s into the early 1970s.
This was the undisputed golden age of the industrial working class.
It really was. The numbers are staggering. At its peak, there were over 1 million people employed in the coal mining industry alone.
Just wrap your head around that. 1 million people going underground, extracting the energy that literally powered the empire.
And it wasn't just coal. It was massive steelworks in Sheffield, expansive textile mills in the north, heavy engineering, shipbuilding in places like Glasgow and Belfast.
These industries provided a rock-solid economic foundation.
Yes. The social contract was incredibly clear. You could leave school at 16 without any advanced qualifications, walk into a job for life, earn a wage that supported a family, secure a guaranteed pension, and live in highly subsidized, affordable council housing.
But the source material makes a crucial pivot here. They argue that this era wasn't just about economic stability. It wasn't just about the paycheck.
No, it was the foundation of an entire rich cultural identity.
This is where we have to look at the sociology of space. These towns and villages didn't just happen to be located near a coal mine or a steel mill. They were built for the industry.
The mine was the gravitational center of the community. Every aspect of civic life orbited around the shift patterns.
Lisa McKenzie describes growing up in this environment, and it completely shatters the modern stereotype of the working class as somehow culturally barren.
Oh, totally.
She talks about how vibrant these communities were. You had miners' welfares, which were these massive community-funded clubs that served as the social hub.
You had local brass bands that competed nationally.
Right. And the Northern soul music scene Enormous football supporters clubs, working men's clubs hosting live entertainment. Your work life and your social life were inextricably linked.
It was a collective existence. And crucially, as Gildart points out, it provided immense dignity. There was a profound masculine pride tied to industrial labor.
Because they were doing such dangerous work.
Right. The men going down the pits knew they were doing incredibly dangerous, physically demanding work, but they also knew they were the ones keeping the lights on for the entire nation.
They possessed immense structural power. Through their trade unions, they could bring the government to a standstill if they were mistreated.
They mattered. They were a force to be reckoned with.
And then, the political and economic winds shift violently in the 1980s. The era of deindustrialization begins. The steel plants are shuttered.
The textile industry is decimated by globalization as production moves to areas with cheaper labor.
And the coal mines are systematically targeted and closed at a staggering, brutal pace. To put a final date on it, by 2015, the very last deep coal mine in the United Kingdom closed its doors forever.
The speed of the collapse was breathtaking. And to truly understand the granular human cost of this macroeconomic shift, the source material zooms in on a specific micro-story.
Shirebrook.
Yes, a town called Shirebrook in Nottinghamshire.
Shirebrook is the perfect tragic microcosm for this entire phenomena. Let's look closely at what happened there.
Well, Shirebrook wasn't just a town. It was established as a model village. This means the physical geography, the layout of the streets, the placement of the schools, the local pubs, the community centers, was entirely designed and constructed around the local coal pit.
The infrastructure existed solely to support the miners and their families.
Exactly. And during the 1984 miners' strikes, which was arguably the most bitter and divisive industrial dispute in modern British history, Shirebrook was right on the front lines.
The atmosphere during that strike cannot be overstated. The source notes that Shirebrook was actually nicknamed Little Belfast during the strike.
Which really tells you everything.
It does. That implies a level of tribal conflict, heavy police presence, and visceral community division that resembles a war zone. You had striking miners fighting desperately for their livelihoods, clashing violently with police and with those who crossed the picket lines to work the scabs.
The trauma of that year burned deep into the generational memory of the town.
But despite their fierce resistance, the strike failed, and eventually the pit closed.
And when you pull the central economic engine out of a model village, the domino effect is catastrophic. Mackenzie describes this collapse in vivid detail. It wasn't just the miners who lost their incomes. The entire microeconomy evaporated.
Right, because if the miners don't have paychecks, they aren't buying meat. So the local butchers close down.
They aren't drinking pints, so the local pubs board up their windows.
Mackenzie specifically mentions the cob shops, which is the local slang for sandwich shops. They went out of business because the textile factories that employed the local women closed down, meaning there were no factory girls coming in on their lunch breaks anymore.
Every node of the local economy simply died.
And what rushed in to fill the vacuum was a wave of social decay. Mass unemployment became the norm.
Followed rapidly by endemic poverty, spikes in mental illness, widespread alcoholism, and a surge in crime. The physical environment degraded.
The local government even began moving difficult tenants from other areas into the empty housing stock in Shirebrook, right?
Yes. Struggling with budgets, they did that, which further exacerbated the social friction. A town built on pride and solidarity became synonymous with precarity.
But the story of Shirebrook takes a truly surreal, almost dystopian turn, because eventually capital did return to the town.
It did. By the 2000s, a massive multinational retail corporation, Sports Direct, decided to build a gargantuan distribution warehouse right in Shirebrook.
And when I say right in Shirebrook, I mean they literally poured the concrete over the ruins of the old coal pit.
The spatial geography is shocking. This isn't a small facility. It is a warehouse that covers 4 square miles. It dominates the landscape.
Here's where it gets really interesting. It is the ultimate visual metaphor for globalism. You witness a vibrant, tight-knit, proud industrial community completely gutted and then geographically overwritten by a monolithic concrete box filled with cheap, imported goods.
Yep.
And this new structure offers absolutely zero cultural meaning, zero community cohesion, and zero dignity to the people living in its shadow.
And initially, it didn't even offer them economic capital. The source material highlights a critical point here.
Oh yeah, about who they hired.
Right. When Sports Direct first opened this massive facility, they largely bypassed the local unemployed population of former miners and factory workers. Instead, they relied heavily on employment agencies to bring in cheap, flexible migrant labor, predominantly from Eastern Europe, specifically Poland.
You can imagine the intense combustible friction that created in the community.
It was a powder keg. You have a devastated, emasculated local male population sitting in a ruined town, watching literal buses of foreign workers being driven in daily.
Doing low-wage, non-unionized work on the exact physical site where their fathers and grandfathers used to earn a dignified living.
The resentment was profound. Now, Mackenzie is careful to note that over time, the temperature lowered. A level of organic assimilation occurred as the local working class and the migrant workers realized they were ultimately in the same boat.
They were both just trying to survive the dictates of multinational capital.
Exactly. Polo shops opened, a local market returned, and a fragile new community dynamic began to form.
But just as they find that fragile equilibrium, the brutal punchline of modern capitalism is delivered: automation.
Yep. Sports Direct begins heavily investing in robotics and automated picking systems.
Where they once needed a massive human workforce, say 200 people to run a section, now they only need a fraction of that, maybe 50 people to monitor the machines.
It's what economists call capital labor substitution. The migrant workers are sent home, the jobs vanish again, and Shirebrook is right back where it started. Hollowed out, precarious, and left behind.
The arc of Shirebrook perfectly illustrates the systemic shift. The industrial working class had leverage, a specialized skill, and a powerful collective identity.
The modern precarious working class is viewed by multinational corporations as entirely disposable friction, a temporary biological necessity to be endured only until an algorithm or a robot can be built to replace them.
It's incredibly bleak. Now, you'd think the obvious escape hatch from a gutted town like Shirebrook is a degree.
Right, education.
Yeah. If the traditional jobs are gone and the warehouses are automating, the natural assumption in a modern Western democracy is that education is the great equalizer. You put your head down, you study hard, you get into a good university, and you climb out of the precarity.
But as we transition into this next area, the source material completely shatters the myth of meritocracy.
They argue that the education system isn't a ladder at all, is it?
No, it's a filtration mechanism designed to keep people exactly where they are. The rhetoric of social mobility is omnipresent in our politics, the idea that it doesn't matter where you start, it's where you finish.
Right.
But Lisa Mackenzie states bluntly that in the UK, meaningful social mobility has effectively ground to a halt. If you are born into low economic and cultural capital, the statistical probability is that you will remain there. And the education system, rather than dismantling class barriers, actively enforces them.
Let's look at the numbers because they are jarring. The source highlights a staggering statistic regarding private education. In the UK, only about 7% of children attend fee-paying private schools. Just 7%.
A tiny minority.
Yet that tiny elite minority goes on to completely dominate the upper echelons of society. They dominate the judiciary, they dominate the senior ranks of journalism and media, the arts, and the highest levels of politics.
Yeah.
How does 7% control so much of the narrative?
It goes right back to Bourdieu. When wealthy parents pay exorbitant fees for a private education, they aren't merely buying smaller class sizes or better chemistry labs or exceptional sports facilities.
Though they are certainly getting those.
Yes, but what they are truly purchasing is social and cultural capital. They are buying the network.
Why?
They are immersing their children in an environment that instills a specific type of poise, a specific cadence of speech, and the unwritten rules of how to exist and thrive in elite spaces. They are buying an impenetrable aura of advantage.
I want to pause here and play devil's advocate, drawing on a very honest moment from the source interview. Peter McCormack, the host of the original podcast, openly admits that he chose to send his own daughter to a private school.
Yes, he does.
And his reasoning is incredibly rational. He says he worked hard, he took on extra overtime, and he sacrificed specifically to buy a better product for his child's future.
It's hard to fault a parent for that.
Right. So he argues that if we were to somehow outlaw or heavily penalize private schools, aren't we just leveling down? Shouldn't the societal focus be entirely on elevating the standards of state schools rather than punishing parents who are just trying to do the best for their kids?
It is the classic tension between rational individual choice and systemic failure. On a micro level, McCormick's decision makes perfect sense. Any parent with the means would want to shield their child from a struggling state system.
Right.
But Mackenzie doesn't actually argue for the abolition of private schools as the silver bullet. She fully agrees that the primary objective must be aggressively elevating state education.
Okay, so where does she disagree?
She points out that the stratification of class runs so deep that it completely infects the state system as well. The state system has historically been designed not to elevate the working class, but to manage them.
And to prove that point, the source shares an anecdote that is it's mind-blowing. It perfectly encapsulates how the system manages expectations.
You're talking about the 1984 Careers Advisor story.
Yes. Keith Gildart recalls going into his school's careers office when he was 16 years old. He's sitting there, and he admits he didn't really enjoy his metalwork or woodwork classes.
Right.
The careers officer asks him what he plans to do with his life. Gildart says, "I'll probably just go down the pit with my dad." And the careers officer looks at him and replies, "Well, you'll have to take metalwork for that."
The psychological ceiling placed on that interaction is profound. The state apparatus represented by that careers officer did not ask, "What are your passions? Do you have an aptitude for science? Have you considered university?"
Not at all.
The system's sole functional objective for a working-class kid in a mining town was to funnel them as efficiently as possible into the local manual labor industry.
Lisa Mackenzie shares a nearly identical experience. The only question she was asked by her school was which specific factory she wanted to be assigned to.
Yep.
She ended up choosing the tights factory simply because her mother already worked there. The horizon was placed mere inches in front of their faces.
It really was.
But a listener might hear that and think, okay, but that was 1984. The world has changed. We have mass university access now. More working-class kids go to university today than at any point in history.
That is mathematically true. There's a massive expansion of higher education. But Gildart points out that the system didn't democratize. It simply moved the goalposts.
How so?
We experienced what economists call credential inflation. As university degrees became more common, they lost their distinguishing value. The elite simply retreated behind a new set of walls.
Right, because not all degrees are created equal in the eyes of the market.
Exactly the opposite. The university sector became heavily stratified. You have an elite tier, Oxford, Cambridge, and the prestigious Russell Group universities, which remained heavily populated by the privately educated 7%.
And then you have a lower tier of newer universities.
Right. Working-class kids are often encouraged into these lower-tier institutions, taking on massive amounts of student debt in the process, only to graduate and find that the premium, high-paying jobs are still strictly locked behind the doors of the elite institutions.
They bought the ticket, but they aren't allowed on the ride.
Precisely. Which leads directly to what Mackenzie calls the lockout of interesting work.
And this statistic absolutely stopped me in my tracks. She references a media conference she attended which revealed that currently only 5% of the people working in British television come from a working-class background. 5%.
The culture industries, television, film, publishing, high-end journalism, have constructed a massive socioeconomic moat. Getting a job in these fields today increasingly requires a young person to move to London,
Which is incredibly expensive.
London is currently experiencing a profound housing crisis and is one of the most expensive cities on the planet. Once there, you are expected to take on a series of unpaid or minimum wage internships just to get your foot in the door.
It's an economic impossibility. If you don't have the bank of mom and dad covering your London rent, buying your groceries, and subsidizing your travel, you simply cannot survive the initiation period.
The working class is mathematically filtered out before the game even begins.
And the cultural consequence of this filtration is devastating. The storytellers of the nation, the people who write the television scripts, direct the documentaries, pen the political editorials, are almost entirely drawn from the same privileged demographic.
It becomes a self-replicating echo chamber. When the people telling the stories have never experienced precarity, the stories they tell about the working class are inevitably skewed.
Mackenzie talks about the deep ingrained class prejudice that pervades these industries, doesn't she?
She does. She points to the pervasive stereotype of the chav in British media, a deeply derogatory caricature used to mock working-class youth. She argues that regional accents are actively penalized.
Wow.
Yeah, if you walk into a media interview in London and you sound like you're from a council estate in the north, that lack of cultural capital is used as a silent filter to reject you. If you don't sound like the elite, you aren't allowed to define the culture.
So let's summarize the incredibly bleak picture we've painted so far. The traditional, dignified industrial jobs have been eradicated. The education system acts as a sophisticated walled garden that filters you out based on your parents' bank account and your regional accent.
Right.
The interesting jobs in the knowledge economy are locked behind a paywall of unpaid internships. If the traditional jobs are gone and the knowledge economy jobs are locked behind a trust fund paywall, you're left with the service sector.
Yep.
Which brings us to the underlying mechanics of our current reality: the low-wage economy and the subsidized employer.
If we examine the macroeconomic structure that replaced the post-war industrial boom, its defining characteristic is engineered precarity. We have transitioned away from a model built on collective bargaining and jobs for life.
It moved aggressively into an economy defined by zero-hour contracts, gig work, and service sector wages.
Wages that are intentionally kept so low they cannot sustain a basic, dignified standard of living.
And this is where the source material highlights a staggering, almost unbelievable political hypocrisy. You have politicians, particularly on the right side of the spectrum, who relentlessly champion free market capitalism.
Right.
They argue fiercely against state intervention, they decry socialism, and they demand that government get out of the way of business. Yet the modern low-wage economy they've built relies entirely on massive, continuous state intervention to keep it from collapsing.
It is arguably the greatest sleight of hand in modern economics. Major corporations and vast hotel chains pay wages that are mathematically insufficient to cover the cost of rent, heating, and food. The free market fails the worker entirely.
So what happens?
The state is forced to step in to prevent mass destitution. The government utilizes taxpayer money to provide welfare benefits, housing benefits, working tax credits, child subsidies directly to these underpaid workers.
Let's trace the flow of that money because it's vital. The taxpayer isn't just helping a struggling family. The taxpayer is functionally subsidizing the profit margins of multinational corporations. If Walmart or a major hotel chain doesn't pay enough for their worker to pay rent, the government pays the private landlord instead. The state is acting as a massive financial crutch for a completely broken capitalist model. It is corporate welfare disguised as poverty relief.
Precisely. And to maintain this model of low wages, you need a specific labor dynamic. This brings the source material to a topic that is always a political lightning rod: immigration.
Okay, yeah.
However, Gildart and McKenzie approach this strictly through the lens of labor economics and class power.
And again, keeping strictly to our neutral stance here, we're just mapping the economic mechanics they describe. The argument presented is that over the last 2 decades, large corporate lobbying groups pushed heavily for expansive immigration policies.
Not out of a sense of global altruism, but to fundamentally alter the supply and demand curve of the labor market.
It is the economic concept of monopsony power combined with an expanded labor supply, right?
Yes. If a local hotel needs a cleaner and there are only 10 local people looking for work, the hotel has to raise its wages and improve its conditions to attract someone. The worker has a degree of leverage.
But if corporate lobbying results in immigration policies that add 1,000 new people to that local labor pool, the leverage completely vanishes.
Because someone in that expanded pool will always be desperate enough to accept the absolute legal minimum wage.
Exactly. The source argues that major corporations in sectors like hospitality, logistics, and agriculture actively shifted away from employing local working-class youth.
They didn't want to deal with local workers who knew their rights, who might attempt to unionize, or who demanded a living wage.
Right. By tapping into a vast pool of foreign-born labor, corporations successively depressed the reservation wage, which is the lowest wage a worker will accept, and stabilized a permanent low-pay model.
Gildart provides a really interesting historical contrast here. He points out that Britain had significant immigration in the 1950s and 60s as well, but the economic integration was completely different.
How so?
Back then, immigrants like Italians coming to work in the massive brickworks in Bedford, or the Windrush generation from Jamaica coming to work in engineering, transport, and the NHS, were stepping into specific, highly unionized, well-paid industrial sectors.
That's the crucial difference. Those 1950s immigrants were assimilated directly into a powerful collective working class culture.
Exactly. They joined the unions, they stood on the picket lines, and they shared in the collective bargaining power.
Whereas today's economic model funnels migrant labor into atomized, non-unionized, precarious gig work. It intentionally fragments the workforce, preventing solidarity and ensuring wages remain stagnant.
Right?
But I have to stop you there and inject some friction, because not every employer is a multinational conglomerate with a lobbying arm. I want to bring Peter McCormack back in. He runs a local coffee shop,
Yes, he's a small and medium enterprise owner, an SME.
and his reality is incredibly stressful. He argues that the constant push for expanded workers' rights, higher mandatory minimum wages, and complex employment regulations is literally suffocating his ability to survive.
It's a very common, very real pain point for local businesses.
He notes that half of his entire revenue goes straight to payroll, and another 25% is eaten up by taxes and compliance regulations. He is terrified of making a bad hire.
Right, because the legal and financial process of terminating a disruptive employee under current regulations could bankrupt his small shop.
So his argument is, if we just blindly cheer for heavy regulations and massive unionization across the board, aren't we just going to crush the local entrepreneur while Amazon and Starbucks use their armies of lawyers to exploit loopholes?
McCormick is describing the exact dysfunction of the modern tax and regulatory code. The system is structurally biased towards scale. A multinational corporation can offshore its profits, exploit tax loopholes, and spread the cost of regulatory compliance across thousands of locations.
They benefit from massive economies of scale.
Exactly. The local coffee shop owner cannot do any of that.
So the small business owner and the low-wage worker are basically trapped in a cage match.
Yes. They are being squeezed by the same system. The SME is suffocated by disproportionate taxation and rent, while the worker is suffocated by inflation and low wages.
They end up fighting each other over the absolute margins. A 50-pence raise here, a slightly cheaper supplier there, while the massive asset holding class hoovers up the vast majority of the wealth entirely unchallenged.
Lisa McKenzie points out that it's an inherently unequal fight. The working class employee doesn't have the leverage to strike against Amazon, so the friction, the anger, and the desperation happen at the local level.
When local businesses are suffocating and workers are relying on state top-ups just to feed their families, you have a full-blown societal crisis. Historically, this is exactly the kind of crisis the political system was designed to address.
Specifically, the Labor Party was literally created by the trade unions to protect the working class from these exact capitalist excesses.
So where were they? Why didn't the political class step in? This brings us to Section 5, Political Abandonment and the Prosecco Socialists.
The source material delivers a damning, comprehensive indictment of the entire modern political establishment. They argue that across the political spectrum, the current crop of politicians no longer functions as public servants representing diverse communities.
Instead, politics has become a closed-loop industry monopolized by a self-serving graduate class.
The demographic shift in who actually gets to be a politician is striking. The source quotes John Major, the former conservative prime minister who famously came from a very modest working-class background in Brixton.
Oh, right. Major observed that 50 years ago, Labor MPs were often former coal miners, postmen, or trade union officials. They lived in the council estates they represented. They sent their kids to the local state schools.
Conversely, conservative MPs often came from local manufacturing businesses or the military. They had tangible, real-world experience before entering parliament.
But today,
Today, the pathway to power is entirely sterilized. It is a highly specific career track. You go to Oxford or Cambridge, you join the Oxford Union Debating Society, you graduate and immediately become a special advisor or a researcher for a think tank in London.
and then you are safely parachuted into a secure constituency by party headquarters. You never have to interact with the real economy.
Well, you described it perfectly earlier. Politics is no longer a calling. It is a greasy pole climbed by professional graduates who share the exact same cultural capital, regardless of which party rosette they wear.
Let's break down how this disconnected class failed on both sides of the aisle, starting with the left. Because Lisa McKenzie, who identifies very strongly with traditional left-wing socialist values, unleashes a blistering critique of the modern Labor Party.
She really does.
She coined these incredible terms for them, the Prosecco Socialists or the Castle Road Mafia.
Her anger is palpable. In Mackenzie's view, the historical mandate of the left was always laser-focused on 5 core material issues: housing, healthcare, education, jobs, and the cost of living.
That is what the working class needs a political party to fight for.
But she argues the modern left has been entirely captured by wealthy, insulated urbanites, the Prosecco Socialists.
Then because these urbanites already have secure housing and well-paying jobs, they don't care about the bread and butter issues.
Exactly. They have abandoned class economics in favor of hyper-focusing on cultural identity politics, abstract international issues, and policing language.
They push progressive social policies from the comfort of their million-pound townhouses in London enforcing these views on struggling working-class towns in the North while remaining entirely insulated from the negative economic consequences of those policies.
The interview also takes a very hard look at New Labor, the era of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown in the late 90s and 2000s. Blairism was often celebrated as a brilliant modernization of the left, a third way.
But the guests argue it was fundamentally a disaster. They describe Blairism as being just as destructive to the working-class infrastructure as Thatcherism was.
To understand why they say that, we have to look at the economic mechanism of the New Labor years. When Blair and Brown took power, they didn't reverse the deindustrialization of the 80s.
They didn't rebuild the manufacturing base or empower the trade unions.
Instead, they embraced the massive financial deregulation of the City of London.
The financialization of the economy.
Yes. The banks were making unprecedented, often reckless profits. This generated an enormous bubble of tax revenue for the government. Gordon Brown took those massive tax receipts from the financial sector and used them to artificially expand the state.
As Mackenzie puts it, they sloshed money around.
Exactly. They poured billions into creating thousands of low-level public sector jobs, they funded superficial community centers, and they expanded the welfare state to act as a band-aid over the rotting industrial towns.
But it's a house of cards. Because they didn't fix the underlying economic engine.
Precisely. They masked the decay with financial sector tax receipts. So when the global financial system completely imploded in 2008, the tax revenues vanished overnight.
The state had to drastically contract through austerity, and all those superficial community projects and public sector jobs evaporated.
The working class communities collapsed all over again because they never actually had a solid foundation.
So the left abandoned them for identity politics and debt-fueled state expansion. What about the right? The Conservative Party doesn't escape the blame here either.
The right is criticized for initiating the original structural devastation. They drove the aggressive deregulation policies of the 1980s that crushed the unions.
They championed the privatization policies that stripped the nation of its physical assets, selling off the national railways, the water companies, the energy infrastructure, and the social housing stock to private shareholders.
The right fundamentally engineered the low-wage, high-precarity, corporate-subsidized economic model that trapped the working class in the first place.
Okay, put yourself in the shoes of a working-class voter. You live in a deindustrialized town in the north of England. You have voted for the Labour Party for 100 years, and you've watched your town slowly die while the politicians obsess over London.
You know, the Conservative Party deregulated your industry out of existence and sold off your public assets.
Neither side speaks your language, neither side shares your cultural capital, and neither side will fix your economy. What do? You look around for a brick to throw through the window of the establishment.
And this brings us directly to the rise of Reform UK.
The discussion surrounding Reform UK, a populist right-wing insurgent party, is critical to understanding the current political geography of Britain. Both Gildart and Mackenzie make it explicitly clear that they do not agree with Reform's actual policy platform.
Right. Gildart, the historian, astutely points out that Reform's economic policies are essentially turbocharged Thatcherism. More deregulation, lower taxes for the wealthy, which will do absolutely nothing to rebuild a deindustrialized northern town.
But despite fundamentally disagreeing with the policies, they both completely understand why the working class pivoted to them.
It is about disruption. It began with the Brexit vote in 2016. The source material argues that for millions of working-class voters, Brexit wasn't genuinely about the intricate details of European Union trade regulations.
No, it was a desperate tactical attempt by ignored communities to use their ballot to inflict pain on a political consensus that wasn't working for them.
The establishment said remain, so they voted leave simply to force the establishment to pay attention.
And when Brexit didn't magically restore their economic dignity, they looked for the next disruptive tool.
Which is Reform UK. Voting for reform isn't necessarily a deep ideological embrace of their manifesto. It is a primal scream. It is a vote to upend the system.
A New Labour architect once famously said of the working class vote, "We have nowhere else to go," implying the party could take them for granted forever.
And we are now seeing the violent fracture of that assumption.
When neither side of the aisle even speaks your language, much less represents your interests, the psychological fallout is massive. The disconnect between the rulers and the ruled creates a profound national despair. And this leads us to Section 6, the end of days narrative versus rebuilding a national story.
The final portion of the source interview is incredibly somber. When you look at the cumulative psychological toll of deindustrialization, the education lockout, the low-wage economy, and political abandonment, it manifests as a pervasive sense of national decline.
The hosts and the guests agree that the dominant narrative in Britain today is one of civilizational destruction. There is a deep, agonizing feeling that the country is caught in a terminal doom loop, slowly sinking into irrelevance.
But Gilder, drawing on his expertise as an historian, provides a crucial and somewhat hopeful contrast. He reminds us that it doesn't intrinsically have to be this way. He points back to 1945, the aftermath of World War II.
The context of 1945 is vital. The country was literally in ruins. It was bombed out, exhausted, and facing unfathomable levels of national debt.
The economic situation was arguably far worse than it is today. Yet the political class of that era, led by figures like Clement Attlee, managed to construct the National Health Service from scratch, establish a comprehensive welfare state, and initiate a massive nationwide program to build high-quality council housing.
How did they manage that with no money?
Because they possessed a cohesive story. They had a shared national vision of building a new Jerusalem, a better, fairer Britain for the people who had just fought and suffered through a global war.
There was a political consensus that the working class deserved dignity and security.
And today, that shared story is completely gone. There is no national cohesion. Instead, we are fractured into bespoke social media echo chambers, screaming at each other over manufactured culture war issues, while the underlying macroeconomic reality quietly crushes everyone.
And we have to talk about that macroeconomic reality, specifically what has happened since the 2008 financial crash.
What?
The source points to this era as the real engine of the modern doom loop. To save the financial system, central banks initiated a policy known as quantitative easing, or QE.
Let's break down the mechanics of QE, because it sounds like boring financial jargon, but it is arguably the most destructive force for wealth inequality in modern history.
Exactly. Mechanically, quantitative easing involves the central bank creating new digital money and using it to buy government bonds, or gilts.
This floods the financial system with liquidity and artificially suppresses interest rates. Because bonds no longer offer a good return, all that newly created capital desperately hunts for yield elsewhere. It floods into the stock market and into real estate.
So if you were already wealthy, if you owned a portfolio of stocks or multiple properties, the central bank essentially inflated the value of your assets by design. The top 0.1% became unfathomably richer without actually producing any new economic value.
But consider the flip side. For the working class, the people who rely strictly on a wage and don't own assets, QE was a disaster. It inflated the cost of housing to absurd levels, putting homeownership permanently out of reach.
And eventually, all that expanded money supply helped trigger inflation, which destroyed the purchasing power of their stagnant wages. Work simply no longer pays enough to survive the inflated cost of living.
To put the severity of this economic stagnation into perspective, the source brings up a terrifying comparative statistic. If you were to take the United Kingdom and rank it as a state within the U.S. economy, it would rank near the absolute bottom.
It would be poorer than Mississippi.
That statistic should send shockwaves through the political establishment. A former global superpower, with a supposedly advanced economy, is now poorer per capita than the poorest state in America. If you exclude the hyper-wealthy, concentrated elite living in London, the inequality is staggering.
And it begs the ultimate devastating question. Toward the end of the interview, McCormick looks at his guests and asks them directly, can you name one single thing, one service, one institution that the government provides that has actually gotten better in the last 20 years?
The silence that follows that question is deafening. Two incredibly sharp, observant academics struggle to find a single example.
Eventually, they timidly suggest that university access has widened. But even that is immediately caveated by the reality of credential inflation and the massive debt trap it creates for working-class youth.
Health outcomes, markedly worse. State education, strained to the breaking point. Infrastructure, crumbling.
Think about that in the context of your own life. How does this pervasive feeling of national decline impact your day-to-day decisions? Do you feel like you are running on a treadmill, working harder, longer hours, taking on more stress, just to stand completely still?
Because that feeling of exhausted precarity is the lived reality of the dismantled working class.
It is the result of a catastrophic systemic failure of political vision, economic management, and basic human empathy. Okay, let's
Okay.
take a collective breath and recap the immense journey we've just been
We
on.
covered a lot of ground.
We really did. We started by looking past the illusion of the paycheck, exploring Pierre Bourdieu's invisible framework of capital economic, social, cultural, and symbolic.
We saw how the modern working class is forced to navigate a complex society with the fog of war permanently turned on, lacking the maps and safety nets of the elite.
We then walked through the physical and cultural rubble of deindustrialization, using Shirebrook as our guide. We saw how the loss of industry wasn't just a loss of income, but the deliberate erasure of an identity, replaced by the automated, soulless, low-wage warehouses of globalism.
We examined how the education system, far from being a meritocratic ladder, acts as a highly fortified walled garden, preserving the influential jobs for a privileged 7% and locking the working class out of telling their own stories.
We dissected the bizarre, hypocritical economic reality, where taxpayers are forced to subsidize the poverty wages paid by multinational corporations, while local small businesses are simultaneously choked to death by an asymmetrical regulatory and tax code.
And finally, we looked at a detached, insulated, graduate-class political elite that entirely abandoned their base. This abandonment led directly to desperate disruptive voting patterns like Brexit and Reform UK, culminating in a pervasive, sinking feeling of a nation trapped in a terminal doom loop.
It is a sobering, rigorous map of a society that has been systematically dismantled from the bottom up. But I want to leave you with a final provocative thought. Something to mull over as you go about your day, building on what we've learned, but taking it one step further into the future.
Okay, let's hear it.
We've spent this entire time talking about how the manual working class lost their economic power, their community hubs, and their political representation in the 1980s and 90s due to globalization and deindustrialization. But think about what is happening right now with the explosive rise of artificial intelligence.
Oh, that is a fascinating historical parallel to draw.
If the deindustrialization of the 1980s hollowed out the manual working class, will the AI revolution of the 2020s do the exact same thing to the graduate class? If large language models and algorithms can write the legal briefs, draft the political legislation, generate the media content, and write the code.
Yeah, if the middle class suddenly finds themselves completely locked out of the knowledge economy, their specific cultural capital rendered entirely obsolete by a machine.
Exactly. Will they finally understand the story of Shirebrook?
When the fog of war inevitably descends on the middle class, the definition of what constitutes valuable capital is going to change all over again.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We highly encourage you to look closely at your own communities, question the hidden structures of capital around you, and always ask who is really benefiting from the rules of the map. Because until we clear those diagnostic muddy waters, we can't even begin to set the broken bones of our society.
Stay curious.